Story 1 by Mark Henderson. I never thought of myself as the kind of person who gets scared easily. But what happened in my mom's basement, I still don't have a good explanation for it. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you. Mom's lived in that house for almost 30 years. I grew up there, but after I moved out, I didn't visit as often as I probably should have. Recently, she decided to sell the place and asked me to come over and help clean out the basement. The timing worked out. I had a free weekend and it was a good excuse to finally go through some of my old stuff. The house itself is nothing special, just a typical suburban home, the kind that looks like all the others on the block. But the basement, well, that's a different story. I always hated going down there as a kid. It wasn't like anything bad ever happened. It's just that weird feeling you get when you know you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. There was this constant dampness, the faint smell of mold, and a single bulb that flickered more often than it worked. But growing up, I figured that's just how basements were supposed to be. So here I was, years later, standing at the top of those stairs, feeling like I was 10 years old again. I could hear my mom upstairs rummaging through the kitchen, totally unfazed. I wasn't in a rush to go down, but it had to be done. The first couple of hours were uneventful, just boxes of old toys, books, and the kind of junk you accumulate over decades. But then I found it. In the back corner of the basement, tucked behind some dusty old furniture, was a small door. I'd never noticed it before, and I'd been down in that basement plenty of times. The door was so low that I had to crouch to get a good look at it. It wasn't a normal door either, more like a hatch, the kind you'd expect to lead to a crawl space. "Hey Mom, did you know there's a door back here?" I called up the stairs. She didn't answer right away. Eventually, I heard her say, "What door?" But she didn't sound particularly interested. I shrugged it off. Maybe she'd forgotten about it. Or maybe I just never paid attention to that corner when I was younger. I was curious now. I reached for the handle, but it was stuck. The wood had swollen from the damp air, making it hard to pull open. After a couple of tries, I managed to pry it loose. The door creaked loudly, and behind it was a staircase. Not just a crawl space, not some forgotten storage area. This was a full set of stairs leading further underground. That's when I felt the first wave of unease. How had I never seen this before? How had no one mentioned this? I felt my heart rate pick up, but I told myself it was just a weird architectural quirk. Old houses have those, right? I turned on my phone's flashlight and started down the steps. The air got colder with every step, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small room. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small bedroom, and the walls were made of rough stone. The floor was dirt and there was no furniture, just some scattered debris. The whole place looked like it had been untouched for years. As I stood there, scanning the room with my flashlight, I noticed something strange. In one corner, the dirt floor was uneven, like it had been disturbed recently. The more I looked, the more it seemed like someone had been digging. I kneeled down, brushing away some of the loose dirt with my hand. I expected to find old pipes or maybe even some forgotten relic from the previous owners. Instead, I found something worse. A plastic tarp. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled back the tarp slowly, and underneath, I saw something that made my stomach turn. An old, rusted toolbox. It didn't look like it had been down here long, though the tools inside were clean, as if they'd been used recently. I backed up, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would someone bury a toolbox? Why was this whole area hidden behind a door I'd never noticed? I hurried back upstairs, my pulse racing. When I got to the top, I slammed the door shut behind me. "Mom, what's in the basement?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked up from her packing, frowning. "What do you mean? Just old junk." "No, not that. There's another room down there, with a staircase, and I found this weird toolbox buried in the floor. Did Dad ever mention it?" She just stared at me for a moment, like she was trying to remember something but couldn't quite put it together. "That house is old, Mark. There's a lot of things we never used. It's probably just from the previous owners." Her explanation didn't sit right with me. She seemed too calm, too detached, but there was no point in pressing her. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I stayed up late, Googling the history of the house, looking for anything that might explain the room. I didn't find much. Just some old records about how the house had changed hands a few times, but nothing significant. No mention of renovations, no hidden rooms. I haven't been back to the house since. Mom sold it a couple of weeks ago, and I'm honestly relieved. I don't know what I found down there. Maybe it was nothing, just an old, forgotten space. Or maybe it was something I wasn't supposed to uncover. All I know is, sometimes the past stays buried for a reason. Story 2 by Adam Walsh. I never thought cleaning out my uncle's house would be such a big deal. I mean, he wasn't a hoarder or anything, just a quiet guy who liked his privacy. But after he passed, my parents asked me to go through his things. They're living in Florida now, and since I was the only family member still close by, it fell on me to handle his estate. I didn't mind. I'd grown up visiting Uncle Bill's house all the time, and it was familiar, almost comforting. Just a small, single-story place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of house that feels like it hasn't changed in decades. That Saturday morning, I packed a couple of sandwiches, grabbed some gloves and trash bags, and headed over. The house looked the same as always, white paint peeling in spots, the lawn a little overgrown, but otherwise fine. Inside, though, there was a smell. Not a bad one, just stale. Like the place hadn't been aired out in a while. I went room by room, sorting through old photos, books, and clothes. Most of it was typical stuff. Uncle Bill didn't have a ton of personal belongings, and he wasn't the kind of guy who hung on to things with sentimental value. Still, it was a bit sad going through his things, knowing that everything I boxed up or tossed out was a piece of his life. After a few hours, I was about ready to call it a day. The last area I had left was the basement. I'd always hated going down there as a kid. The steps creaked like they were going to give out, and it was cold, even in the summer. But I figured it'd just be more junk to sift through. Old tools and storage boxes, nothing exciting. The door to the basement was one of those old wooden ones with a latch that sticks, and the stairs were narrow, the kind you have to walk down sideways if you're carrying something. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Typical. The power was probably out or the bulb was dead. I turned on my phone's flashlight and made my way down. The further I went, the more that basement smell hit me. Damp, musty, like a mix of dirt and old wood. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the room with my light. It looked like I remembered. Cement floors, stone walls, a couple of shelves with dusty jars, and an old workbench cluttered with tools. I started poking around. There wasn't much down there besides some rusted old tools and cans of paint that had long since dried up. But then, in the far corner, something caught my eye. A section of the wall that didn't look quite right. It was plywood, not stone like the rest of the basement. It seemed like it had been put up recently. I walked over and ran my hand along the plywood. It wasn't nailed down, just leaned up against the wall. Curious, I pulled it away. Behind it, there was a small alcove, just enough space for a person to crouch down in. At first, I thought it was some kind of storage area, but there was nothing in there, just dirt. I figured it was one of those weird, unfinished basement things. Maybe my uncle had meant to fix it up, but never got around to it. I put the plywood back and decided I'd come back to it later if I needed to. But then, just as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard something, a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but it was coming from behind me. I froze. My phone's light shook in my hand as I turned around. The noise came again, soft but distinct. It wasn't the creaking of the floorboards or the groaning of pipes. It was a clicking sound like something tapping on wood. I stood there listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the alcove. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably just a mouse or something. I crouched down, phone in hand, and peered back into the alcove. Nothing. Just the same empty space. I waved the light around, half expecting to see something scurry away, but there was nothing there. Still, the tapping continued. At that point, I was starting to feel ridiculous. There's nothing worse than getting spooked in an empty house by noises you can't explain. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my hands, and decided I'd had enough for the day. I headed back upstairs, closed the basement door, and didn't think much about it after that. But later that night, when I was sitting on my couch at home, I kept replaying that sound in my head. It wasn't just some random noise, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A few days later, I had to go back to the house to finish packing things up. I'd been avoiding the basement, but something kept nagging at me. I couldn't stop thinking about that alcove, about what could have been causing that sound. This time, I brought a friend with me, Tom, who'd known Uncle Bill too. I didn't tell him about the noise though, I didn't want to sound paranoid. We spent most of the day in the living room clearing out boxes, but eventually we made our way back down to the basement. "Hey, you know about this?" I asked, pointing out the plywood section. Tom looked over and shrugged. "Looks like some kind of patch job." I nodded but didn't say anything. I pulled the plywood back again and the alcove looked just as I'd left it. But when I crouched down and shined my light into the space, something was different. There was a small metal object half buried in the dirt. "What's that?" Tom asked, leaning in. I reached out and dug it up. It was an old key, rusted, worn, but definitely a key. I turned it over in my hand, confused. "What's it for?" Tom asked. I had no idea. There were no locked doors in the house, at least none that I'd found. I don't know if I'll ever figure out what that key was for. I don't know if it had anything to do with the noises I heard that day. But what I do know is, after we finished clearing out that house, I never went back into that basement again. Some things are better left alone. Story 3, provided by Jason Keller. Renovating a house isn't as glamorous as people think. My name's Derek, and my wife Lisa and I bought a fixer-upper a couple of months ago. It wasn't a total wreck, but the basement was a different story. It was damp, the walls were cracked, and the floor was uneven. But Lisa had big plans, turning it into a cozy guest room or maybe a home gym. You know, just something nice. I wasn't crazy about the idea of spending so much time and money on a basement, but I went along with it. We hired this contractor, Mike, a local guy, seemed competent, knew what he was doing, so the renovation started. A few days in, Mike told me he'd found something unusual while clearing out some old brickwork. "There's a small room behind one of the walls," he said, looking a little uneasy. I was skeptical, but I went to check it out. Sure enough, behind a crumbling section of the basement wall, there was this small, narrow space, maybe 6 feet by 4. It wasn't on any of the blueprints, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, there was an old, rusted metal box, half buried in dust. Nothing sinister about it, just one of those weird things you find in old houses. I pried the box open later that night. Inside were a few old documents, nothing valuable. Just letters, written in a language I didn't understand, probably German or Dutch. Lisa joked about it being some forgotten time capsule, but I felt unsettled. It wasn't the letters themselves. It was the thought of what kind of person would seal off a room with this stuff in it and never mention it. The next day, Mike didn't show up for work. When I called him, he said he'd hurt his back, but something in his voice didn't sound right. After that, he became hard to reach. I figured maybe he was flaking out, so I tried another contractor. But then, strange things started happening. The first thing was subtle. Lisa and I began noticing small noises coming from the basement, mostly at night. A slight tapping sound like pipes knocking. I chalked it up to the old plumbing, but it kept happening, every night. Then, one morning, Lisa asked me if I'd been in the basement the night before. I hadn't. She said she heard footsteps, heavy ones like someone pacing around. I told her it was probably the house settling. After all, old houses make noise, right? Still, it felt strange. A few days later, I went down to check on the progress myself. As I stood in the middle of the basement, I noticed something odd. The small room Mike had uncovered, its door was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it. But things get bumped, things shift. I pushed it back closed and told myself not to overthink it. Later that week, I got another contractor to finish the job. This guy, Tom, didn't seem fazed by the room or the weird box we'd found. He finished patching the walls and poured new concrete over the floor. The place looked good finally. We even started storing some stuff down there, boxes, holiday decorations, that kind of thing. But one night, as I was putting some things away, I noticed a faint smell. Not bad, just strange. Damp, musty, like something had been sealed off for too long. I dismissed it, thinking it was just the lingering effects of the renovation, but it stuck with me. Then came the last straw. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. I don't know what woke me, but I felt this overwhelming sense that something was off. I got up, walked down to the basement, and flicked on the light. Everything looked normal. But when I turned to head back upstairs, I noticed something out of place. A small pile of dirt by the far wall. It hadn't been there the last time I checked. I knelt down, touched it. The concrete floor was cracked beneath it. I didn't know how to explain it. Maybe the foundation was settling, or maybe the new concrete hadn't set properly. But either way, it freaked me out. The next day, I called Tom. He came over and patched it up. He didn't seem too concerned. Just said it was probably a minor issue, nothing to worry about. But I was done. Lisa and I talked, and we both agreed it was time to move. The house, it just didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't haunted, no, it wasn't cursed. But something about it, or maybe just that basement, it got under my skin. We moved out last month, left it to someone else to deal with. If there's one thing I learned, it's that sometimes it's not what's hidden in the dark that scares you. It's what you let fester in your mind.